Welcome to the podcast "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages. Although, for this episode, as for the last and for the one that follows, we are going to be traveling back in time, and this is actually fact and fiction about the Roman Republic. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. I'm so pleased to welcome back as my co-host, my good friend, Dr. Jennifer Paxton of the Catholic University of America, to continue our discussion of the fall of the Roman Republic.
Thank you, Richard. It is great to be back.
In the first episode of this series, we described what the Roman Republic looked like on paper, what its constitution was, and we talked about how the culture of the Roman elite shaped politics. Rome had a mixed constitution, but Rome was essentially an oligarchy, and those who ruled this oligarchy came from about, at most, 100 families. If you haven't listened to that episode, you might want to do so now. We'll be here when you come back.
We left off the last episode with Marius and Sulla.
The history of Rome between Sulla's first march on Rome in 88 BCE and the establishment of the so-called Principate by Augustus in 27 BCE is one of political violence and instability at home and tremendous military success abroad. The two were related.
The discontent of men such as Sulla, who had been one of Marius's most successful military lieutenants, and their hostility toward Marius found its roots here. Equally disturbing was Marius's route to office. He had been elected consul because of his military talent rather than his auctoritas. In this, he was the father of a new breed of consuls who led their armies in the name of Rome, but whose legions often became extensions of their own ambitions.
One reason for the rise of these military dynasts was the constant warfare of the 1st century BCE, much of which took place upon Italian soil. Between 90 and 80 BCE, some 250,000 to 300,000 Italians served under arms. After 78 BCE, the total number of men serving in the Roman military averaged in excess of 90,000 a year and reached the neighborhood of perhaps as many as 600,000 during the second half of the civil wars that destroyed the Republic.
The Italian agrarian economy was devastated by these wars. The Spartacus slave rebellion from 74 to 71 BCE, which took 10 legions to suppress, was particularly destructive.
As was Rome's war against its Italian allies, fought about 20 years earlier. That war, oddly called in history books the Social War, because Latin socii means ally, was fought because of Rome's refusal to extend citizenship to its Italian allies. The Allies' response was to demand either citizenship or complete independence, which resulted in all-out war throughout Italy between 91 BC and 87 BC.
Not only were crops and goods plundered, but the billeting of soldiers and forced requisition of supplies impoverished thousands of peasants unlucky enough to hold land in the path of an army's advance. It was like Hannibal all over again. Italian society became saturated with violence. Poverty bred crime. In the late Republic, brigandage made travel through the countryside without an armed entourage risky, and by the 70s BCE, elections in Rome were constantly attended by street violence, as a new generation of politicians campaigned with armies of street thugs.
While Italian warfare devastated the personal economies of small landowners, warfare abroad, first in the Hellenistic East and then in Gaul, carried with it the promise of great wealth for the successful general and valuable plunder and bonuses for his troops. These wars made the ruling class of Rome fabulously wealthy and transformed the Roman armies they commanded into armies of clients, loyal to the commanders who paid them and who enriched them with booty. Roman elections became extremely expensive. The stakes also increased. Elections were no longer mainly about enhancing the dignity of oneself and one's family. Victory now meant the opportunity to increase one's wealth, both in office and at the head of a victorious army, and even more significantly, afterwards as governor of a province. Defeat could mean financial and political ruin. The most famous example of this is the Catiline conspiracy. In 63 BC, the patrician Lucius Sergius Catilina, facing prosecution for corruption as governor of Africa and unsuccessful in 3 consular elections, attempted a violent coup d'etat. Catilina, joined by a handful of other politically frustrated senators, raised an army of the resentful and disappointed. The bulk of this force was made up of impoverished rural plebeians and veterans of Sulla's legions who felt under-rewarded. This was the Catiline conspiracy, made famous by Cicero and Sallust. It gave Cicero the opportunity to do something during his consulship. After defeating the conspirators in a skirmish in which Catilina fell, Cicero rounded up the surviving main conspirators and ordered them to be executed. Cicero's refusal to allow them trials, as was their right, was to bite him in the ass. A few years later, when Cicero's political enemies were in the ascendancy, Cicero was himself prosecuted for violating the rights of Roman citizens. He was convicted and went briefly into exile. The Roman Republic was an extraordinarily litigious society. For classicists, perhaps the most significant consequence of the conspiracy was that it provided Sallust with the subject of one of the great works of the Roman Golden Age of literature, as well as Cicero's 4 Catilinarian orations justifying his actions in suppressing the conspiracy. These orations became part of the standard medieval and Renaissance rhetorical curriculum. Literary scholar D.H. Berry notes that Bill Clinton was inspired to study law because of his experience defending Catilina in a mock trial in his high school Latin class. It also forms the backdrop for a nifty Roman murder mystery by the recently deceased historical novelist John Maddox Roberts, which I highly recommend. The Republic teetered on, but it was now dominated by ambitious military dynasts who competed against both the old elite represented by the Senate and against each other. The surest way to power was not through election, but by marching on Rome.
And this brings us back to the main culprits in the fall of the Roman Republic: Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian.
What I find especially interesting about this cast of characters is that with the exception of Sulla and Crassus, all of them were in one way or another outsiders. Pompey came from the wealthiest and most powerful family of Picenum along the Adriatic coast. His father was a new man. Caesar belonged to a distinguished patrician family, the Julian clan, but his family branch was one of the poorer parts of that family and had distinguished itself in generations. Mark Antony was a new man. He came from the equestrian class. And Octavian was just one of Julius Caesar's 3 great-nephews until Caesar decided to adopt him and make him his heir.
Well, if they were the outsiders, who were the insiders?
The vast majority of Roman consuls during the 1st century BCE were individuals whom only specialists in Roman history and classicists have ever heard of. The consulship was swapped among members of Rome's great houses, notably the Claudii, the Aemilii, the Caecili Metelli, Cornelii, and the Domitii. What distinguished Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Mark Antony from their contemporaries was their ambition. As Jenny and I discussed in the first episode, all males of Rome's senatorial class were ambitious to add the consulship to their resumes. But that wasn't sufficient for these men. They used their position as consul, especially proconsul, to try to dominate Rome, and they did this not by leading street mobs, but by commanding Roman armies and acting like those Roman armies were their clienteles.
The first Roman general to march on Rome was a charter member of the old elite, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla had been Marius's most capable and successful military lieutenant during the Numidian War.
Yeah, he personally captured King Jugurtha and had a signet ring made depicting the surrender of the kingdom. Marius, who didn't like to share credit, wasn't pleased by that.
I imagine not. Marius quickly became jealous of his subordinate, possibly because of Sulla's superior social status, and he did everything possible to hinder his advancement. But Sulla's talents won out. In 89 BCE, he won a decisive victory in the Social War, in which Rome fought its own Italian client states.
Yeah, and they were fighting not to be separated from Rome. It wasn't a rebellion against Rome. The weird thing about this is they were fighting for Rome to extend citizenship to them. And in order to win this war, Rome eventually had to win the support of so many of those city-states by doing exactly that, extending citizenship to them. And by the end of this, Italy, all of Italy, really became Roman citizens.
It actually was a very important step in the creation of what would become the Roman state.
Yes.
Now, Sulla was rewarded for his victory in the Social War by being elected to the consulship. It was a good time to be consul. Rome needed to send an army against Mithridates VI, king of Pontus in Asia Minor, and Sulla was their man. This was a really plum opportunity for Sulla. Mithridates was fabulously wealthy.
I love that. Yeah, he really was.
He was. He was fantastic. He's also the subject of a very obscure opera by Mozart.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And the general who defeated him would gain incredible riches.
The First Mithridatic War, there were 3 in all, from 88 BC to Mithridates VI's death in 63 BC, exposes how Roman imperialism operated in practice. Mithridates ruled an extremely prosperous kingdom in Asia Minor. Asia Minor is the peninsula that comprises most of modern-day Turkey. The kingdom of Pontus stretched along the eastern shore of the Black Sea, and as I said, was extremely wealthy. But Mithridates was not satisfied. He sought hegemony over all eastern Asia Minor, and that brought him into conflict with Rome. Since 133 BC, the western half of the Anatolian Peninsula was the Roman province of Asia. When Mithridates attempted to install puppet kings on the thrones of neighboring Cappadocia and Bithynia, their disappointed rivals appealed to the Roman Senate for aid, promising in return to become Rome's clients. Rome responded by sending a senatorial legation to Mithridates, a legation backed by the legions stationed in the province of Asia. The negotiations led to Mithridates accepting Rome's preferred candidates. Peace in the region was restored, and Rome's influence in the region was expanded. But before the legation left, they advised the new client kings of Bithynia and Cappadocia to attack Mithridates' lands to raise the enormous sums of money needed to repay the loans they had taken out to bribe Roman senators. Unsurprisingly, the negotiated peace lasted for less than a year. Rome, as Jenny and I discussed in the previous episode, only fought quote-unquote just wars, which meant wars to avenge a wrong or insult to Rome or to its clients. The casus belli, the cause of war that allowed the Romans to declare war against Mithridates, was Mithridates' invasion of Cappadocia in violation of his agreement with the Roman legation.
The war, moreover, was popular. The massacre of Italian merchants in Pontus provided good propaganda.
And not just in Pontus, he seems to have orchestrated a much larger massacre throughout the region, including in cities of the Roman province itself. First-century Latin historians give the number of dead in excess of 80,000, but this may be an exaggeration. Figures in ancient and medieval literary sources are notoriously unreliable. Mithridates understood that by attacking Rome's client kings, he was in effect declaring war on Rome itself, and the massacre can be seen as a preemptive strike to weaken Rome's support in the region.
Even more to the point, the legions raised to fight Mithridates knew that booty and loot lay in their future.
Rome, and it's important to realize this, Rome was always at war, but Rome didn't have a standing army. Consuls raised armies as the need arose, and it's pretty much the first thing a consul would do when being elected is raise the army. Sulla's reputation for being a soldier's general, always looking out for the welfare of his men, made it easy for him to recruit. During the social war, he had won the affection of his troops by relaxing discipline when he could, and by permitting them free rein in looting cities that they took. How could you not love a general like that?
Right.
Consequently, Sulla had little difficulty raising 6 legions, which he assembled in camp at Capua. Then, incredibly, Marius, 69-year-old Marius, decided that he wanted one more shot at it. He came forward to claim the command. Supported by a tribune of the plebs, Marius appealed to the popular assembly, which stripped Sulla of command and replaced him with the old hero. I should remind our listeners, especially those who have not yet heard the previous episode, that by now the Roman elite had fractured into 2 political factions: the populares, who advanced the radical claim that the assemblies of the Roman people were the sovereign authority of the republic, and the Optimates, literally the best men, who supported the traditional deference of the assemblies and the magistrates to the Senate. The senators who protested the proceedings were violently driven out from the forum. When the news reached Sulla, he addressed his 35,000 soldiers, informing them about the events that had transpired in Rome. And I can imagine how they said, "Oh, that's so sad. You're not going to be leading us. We're really, really sad about that."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he informed them that he had been replaced by Marius, that Marius would be leading this campaign. And then he added that Marius would probably raise his own troops for the campaign, which would deprive them of their chance for wealth. And that really did turn the trick. The soldiers began to cry out that Sulla needed to correct this, that they should march on Rome, and Sulla reluctantly acceded to their demands.
I'm sure it was very reluctant. Sulla's army took the city, setting fire to some buildings along his route. Marius, now outlawed, fled to Africa. After Sulla restored the Senate and annulled the assembly's transfer of command, he departed with his army to the east, where he conducted a highly successful campaign against Mithridates. In his absence, Marius and his supporters returned to Rome and regained control of the city. Marius was elected to his 7th and final consulship in 86 BC and celebrated his victory by massacring Sulla's friends and supporters, many of whom died at the hands of Marius's notorious personal bodyguard of 4,000 runaway slaves.
Runaway slaves? That probably comes from a source hostile to Marius and to the populares. Sorry, back to the story.
Soon after Marius was elected to his unprecedented 7th consulship, he died. But Rome remained in control of the popular faction.
Sulla, having defeated Mithridates' forces in a series of battles in Greece, negotiated a treaty to end the war and returned with his troops to Rome in 83 BCE. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Sulla's battle-hardened forces routed their opponents. Among the local magnates who turned out in support of Sulla was a young noble of rural ancestry named Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. He becomes known in history as Pompey the Great. Now, Pompey managed to raise 3 full legions from among his clients and his tenants. Another young noble who came to Sulla's aid was Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was to gain the reputation of being the wealthiest man in Rome. The third and most famous of the future triumvirs, Gaius Julius Caesar, was still only in his late teens and on the other side of the political fence, a member of the popular faction related by marriage to both Marius and to Marius's top henchman, Cinna. Sulla's victory in Italy left him in charge of Rome. Appointed dictator by a grateful Senate, Sulla began to clean house. His purpose was to restore the power and dignity of the Senate by abolishing the institutions of government that had eroded senatorial authority, notably the veto power of the tribunes. He accomplished this by re-emphasizing the ancient oligarchical traditions and customs, and by killing as many of the popular faction as possible.
Plutarch relates how Sulla, on the morning after his troops took Rome, summoned the Senate to attend him in the temple of Bellona on the Campus Martius. While he reassured them that he had come to restore the Commonwealth, his speech was interrupted by loud screams and wailing erupting from the neighboring Villa Publica, a large public enclosure ordinarily reserved for the business of the censors. The senators were obviously startled and distracted by the sounds, but Sulla, quote, continuing his speech with a calm and unconcerned countenance, bade them listen to what he had to say, and not busy themselves with what was doing out of doors. He had given directions for the chastisement of a few offenders.
I love that, a few offenders.
Right, the few offenders numbered 6,000. But these were mere soldiers taken during the previous day's fighting. Sulla's security lay in exterminating their betters. Soon the heads of the 2 elected consuls, one of whom was Marius' son, decorated the rostra in Rome. An additional 80 senators and 1,600 moneybags equestrian entrepreneurs who had profited from Marius' confiscations were promptly singled out for death and a bounty offered for their heads. In this unstable, violent climate, individuals claiming to be adherents of Sulla seized the opportunity to settle scores with their enemies.
To protect the innocent and to allay their fears, or so he told the Senate, Sulla decided that he would regularize the criminal prosecutions by having the names of the condemned posted on a daily basis in the forum. The lives and property of those who were proscribed, literally those whose names were written down and made public, were declared forfeit. Their killers were to be commended and rewarded handsomely with a 48,000 sesterces bounty for their patriotism. That translates to about a year's wages for a skilled craftsman and to about 25 times the annual stipend of an ordinary soldier, which is why bonuses and booty was so important to ordinary soldiers. Anyone who received a proscribed person, whether father, son, or brother, would share in his fate. Since the victims of the Sullan terror were often men of substance, some charged that wealth rather than treason was the true crime of many of these guys. Sulla and the state profited greatly from the confiscations, as the property of traitors was auctioned off. If Sulla was merciless to his enemies, he was also generous to his friends.
Thousands perished in the 6-month Sullan terror. The 19-year-old Julius Caesar only survived because of his lack of prominence.
Is that great?
And his family connections. Finally, in 79 BC, Sulla announced that he had completed his work, and he retired to a private life of luxury and dissipation. Ancient authors were struck by Sulla's extremes. He oscillated between fits of enormous energy and periods of indolence and debauchery. He was dead within a year.
Yeah. Sulla's career, even more than Marius's, was an indication of the dangerous transformation that was occurring in the Roman army. Sulla had marched on Rome in 88 BCE and again in 83 BCE, ostensibly to defend the Senate and to overturn the illegal acts of the assembly and the Marian usurpers. The bloodbath he directed between 83 and 79 BC was meant to restore the Senate to its old position of authority. In other words, Sulla thought of himself as a traditional Roman defending the ancient traditions, institutions, and mores of the Republic. But his actions, especially his marches on Rome, defined him as something quite different and new. As one historian commented, to restore the Republic, quote, Sulla decimated the knights, muzzled the tribunate, and curbed the consuls, but even Sulla could not abolish his own example and preclude a successor in his domination.
As historian Philip Spann concluded, Sulla had discovered the secret of the Republic, quote, that powers and laws lay not in the laws and traditions of the Republic as administered by the slow, difficult, and uncertain consensus of the Senate and the popular assemblies, but in a loyal army made up of men whose experience in war and devotion to their commander had been forged in an extended provincial command, of men who were eager for farms and retirement, men ready to conquer Rome and kill Romans for their general and their price. End quote.
I would push back a little on this. I tend to be a skeptic, but I think some historians of this period are too cynical about the motives of the rank and file of the legions of the Civil War. Roman legions in the late Republic continued to be citizen armies. Many of Sulla's soldiers and later Caesar's and Octavian's believed that they were, in fact, fighting to defend the Republic against those who would overturn it. None of the military dynasts announced a goal of establishing a monarchy. The troops may have looked to their generals as patrons, but they also had to believe that they fought for Rome. Octavian, as we'll see, prepared to fight Mark Antony by first launching a propaganda campaign throughout Italy, branding Antony as a renegade Roman seduced by an Egyptian harlot and a threat to the Republic. One could and can fight for both country and for personal gain. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Ironically, Sulla's true heir and star pupil was to be the popularis Gaius Julius Caesar.
Sulla's troops had followed him not because he was a defender of the old order, but because he was their general and patron. Similarly, Marius had managed to obtain power one last time in 86 BC because of the support of veterans of his armies, whom the Senate, at his urging, had settled in military colonies in Italy and Africa. Upon seizing power, Sulla emulated Marius on a large scale. He is said to have settled 120,000 soldiers in various colonies in Italy, granting each modest plots of land. He did this not to rehabilitate the assiduate class, not to increase the manpower pool for the Roman military, like Tiberius Gracchus had attempted to do. He did this because these were his clients, and he could always call upon them if he needed military support. He obtained the land by expropriating property from Marian settlers and their neighbors. The large estates that he confiscated from his wealthy enemies went to his favored lieutenants and political supporters. The most prominent of these were two young nobles, Pompey and Crassus, both of whom led forces in support of Sulla, raised from among their own clients. Quote, "No man is truly wealthy," Crassus is supposed to have said, "who cannot raise a legion from his own clients." End quote.
A new age of violence had been introduced into Roman politics. Sulla had tried to make the world safe for the Senate, but had instead provided a model for the generals who made up the first and second triumvirates.
Yeah, Jenny's absolutely spot on right about this. Sulla believed that he had restored the Republic by restoring the authority of the Senate. But the lesson he really taught was that political power rested in control of Rome's armies. The Sullan constitution lasted only about 20 years. From Sulla's death in 78 BC until 60 BCE, power was largely in the hands of the Roman Optimates, the old line nobility who had been favored by Sulla. Despite the occasional conspiracy and attempted coup d'etat during these years, the Sullan constitution had held firm. Standing a bit apart from the inner circle of oligarchs were two of Sulla's chief young military lieutenants, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Crassus had the right pedigree, but his desire for wealth and power marked him out as something of a shady character. He won some glory fighting for Sulla, and was to gain even more by defeating the formidable Spartacus, though Pompey was to steal some of the credit. But Crassus's real claim to fame was his wealth. Purportedly the richest man in Rome, he had profited greatly from the confiscations under Sulla. He also made a fortune running a private fire brigade, and by buying up for a pittance, burned properties. And I'll just stop for a second and say the way that he did this is really amazing. A fire would break out. He would show up with his fire brigade, but he wouldn't start putting out the fire until the poor proprietor watching their property burning down would sell it to him for a literal fire sale price. Yes. And then he would have his guys put the fire out.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. He had great political influence among the equestrian order, whose business ventures he bankrolled, and with impoverished senators, to whom he lent money on easy terms. But Crassus seems to have grown dissatisfied with possessing mere wealth. He was openly envious of Pompey's triumphs, and like others of his class, he wanted the opportunity to enhance his dignitas through a glorious military command.
Yeah. What Crassus wanted above all was to be awarded a triumph. A triumph was the highest honor that a Roman general could enjoy. It's tempting to think of it as a military ticker-tape parade, and it was that, but it was also a lot more. Triumphs were imbued with religious significance. They could only be granted by the Senate and were reserved for commanding generals whose victories had significantly benefited Rome. The general, known as a triumphator, wore a purple and gold toga associated with both Rome's ancient monarchy and with the statue of Jupiter Capitolinus. He was, in a sense, a king for the day. He would ride in a chariot drawn by 4 horses. Driven before him were the most important of the enemy captives, and they were held in chains. Following them came wagons brimming with captured weapons and with treasures taken in war. Next came Rome's senators, magistrates, and lictors wearing red war robes and carrying fasces wreathed in laurel. Behind the triumphator's chariot marched his soldiers clad in togas, as weapons were not legally allowed to be carried within the sacred confines of Rome. The procession would wind its way through the streets of the city, thronged with cheering crowds, and would end at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, where the triumphator would offer a sacrifice at the feet of the statue of Jupiter. Crassus's father had been granted one. Pompey would be awarded an unheard-of total of 3. The refusal of the Senate to grant him a triumph to celebrate his victory over Spartacus really steamed Crassus. What he wanted now was a choice military command that would give him the opportunity to win a victory so great that the Senate would have to recognize it with a triumph.
I think Crassus is really the sort of the much less prominent third leg of this stool.
Yeah, sort of like Lepidus in the second.
Very much Lepidus.
Yeah, very much like Lepidus. If Crassus was a byword for wealth, Pompey's name became synonymous with military success. He didn't come from an ancient Roman clan, but belonged instead to the elite of the Italian countryside. He may have even been of non-Latin stock. His father, Cneius Pompeius Strabo, was a new man, the first of his family to have held the consulship. Pompey's own public career was highly eccentric. He came to prominence in 83 BC when at the age of 23, he raised and led 3 legions in support of Sulla, all of them drawn from his father's clients and tenants. Sulla immediately recognized the young man's military gifts and sent him first to Sicily and then to Africa to mop up the Marian supporters in those provinces. Pompey's brutality in these campaigns against other Romans gained him the nickname the Boy Butcher. And that was a nickname given to him by his detractors. The name that was given to him by his supporters and by a grateful Senate, under Sulla's influence, of course, was the cognomen Magnus, the Great. And he used that from the rest of his life in place of Strabo. These were the first of a series of private commands, imperium without magistracy, that Pompey held. Because of his obvious military talent, he was entrusted by the Senate with major military commands while he was still in his 20s. This is unheard of. Before he was even officially eligible to stand for the lowest of the major public offices, that of quaestor. In fact, the very first magistracy that Pompey held was that of the consulship. And that's, again, you can't do that. But he did that, and he was elected that in 70 BCE when he was still 6 years shy of the minimum age of 42. Sulla may have established the cursus honorum, but as in so many other things, Pompey's dignitas superseded custom, or even the constitution. The ambition and success of Sulla's young supporter made him a threat to the restored oligarchy that the old dictator had shed so much blood to establish. Pompey's military command spanned the Mediterranean world. He won distinction in Africa, Spain, and Italy, where he crushed the remnants of Spartacus' slave army. In 67 BCE, the Senate entrusted him with an extraordinary 3-year command to sweep the Mediterranean of the Cilician pirate fleets that had almost assumed the status of an independent state. Given imperium over the entire Mediterranean Sea and its coastline up to 50 miles inland, his imperium superseded the imperium of local governors. Pompey was authorized to raise a fleet of about 500 ships and to recruit 125,000 sailors, and assigned the necessary funds to pay for a 3-year campaign. As it turned out, he didn't need all of those resources. It took him only a matter of months to eradicate the pirate fleet and to take control of their havens. Though the war against the pirates was perhaps Pompey's greatest military accomplishment, his defeat of Mithridates between 66 and 63 BCE and the subsequent so-called settlement of the East brought him to the apex of his fame and prestige. His success in the East had been largely assured by the victories of a great predecessor, Lucullus, whose independent actions had made him suspect to the Senate. Pompey, nevertheless, got credit for closing the chapter on Mithridates' embarrassingly resilient career in opposition to Rome,
as Pompey had done by mopping up the remnants of Spartacus's army after Crassus had done the heavy lifting.
Yeah, Pompey had skill, but he also had great timing.
Pompey followed his victory by marching through Asia Minor and the Near East, organizing the Hellenistic kingdoms of the region into tribute-paying client states, accepting all the while the personal clientage of individual rulers.
Pompey may have corruptly enriched himself in doing so, but, his settlement of the East was the work of military and political genius. Pompey established a defensible and relatively low-cost eastern frontier.
Pompey was a great general and a man of true administrative talents, but he was nevertheless an outsider in the world of the old Roman aristocracy.
Given how much the Roman Republic was a deferent society based upon inherited familial honor, that really mattered.
The chief men of the Senate used his military skills and honored him with triumphs and the most important military appointments, but they never fully accepted him as one of their own. He always remained in their eyes a soldier, some would say a useful butcher, rather than a real gentleman.
Pompey, for his part, mistrusted the Senate and its leaders. They had failed to support him adequately in his campaign against Marian guerrillas in Spain, had refused to grant his veterans land, had even begrudged him his well-earned triumphs.
Pompey, the landed grandee, had even less affinity for the urban mob or poor rural laborers. As the son of a new man, he was anxious about preserving his dignity. Old-line nobles such as Caesar or Clodius, confident in their innate superiority, could indulge in familiarity with the low-born, not Pompey. Without any true ideology to guide him, Pompey swung back and forth uncertainly between the Optimates and the populares, always desirous of the former's approval, always on guard against expressions of their contempt. As consul in 70 BC, he and his colleague Crassus overturned much of the Sullan revolution by restoring the veto power of the tribunes. But in doing this, Pompey probably was motivated less by popular sentiments than by pique at the Senate's lack of support for his Spanish campaign and irregular candidacy for consul. A decade later, Pompey joined forces with Crassus and Caesar to seize control of the Roman Senate. A decade after that, he was once again the darling of the senatorial class, as the specter of Caesar loomed menacingly from Gaul. Pompey's political swings were less a matter of his doing than of his treatment by the Optimates. When in their favor, he was their reliable general. When spurned, he turned against them. Like Caesar, Pompey had traditional noble aspirations. He didn't seek to overturn the Republic as much as to dominate it as the first citizen. But he was less expert than his colleague in the politics of manipulation. Whereas Caesar was a great politician who excelled as a general, Pompey was a great general.
Yes. All Roman politics in the Republic was personal. It was personal to the small circle of men who monopolized the political process. One supported the candidacies and the actions of friends and kinsmen and opposed the advancement of enemies. Political alliances were termed friendships. That's the word that they used. And they were sealed with marriages. Mutual service and support rather than affection lay at the heart of such friendships. In 61 BCE, Pompey, angered by the Senate's reluctance to ratify his treaties in the East and to provide land for his veterans, joined two other powerful outsiders, his erstwhile rival, the wealthy Crassus, and Crassus's protege, the ambitious young Caesar, in a pledge of quote-unquote friendship. This was the so-called First Triumvirate. Triumvirate simply means the three men, right? Each triumvir had his goals and ambitions. Caesar, who had been denied a triumph for his military victories in Spain, sought election to the consulship in 60 BCE and a province with potential for his proconsulship. Pompey, for his part, wanted his decisions in the East to be ratified and his veterans settled. He wanted his auctoritas, his authority, to be appreciated and recognized. And Crassus aimed at a major military command that would bring him the dignitas that he really craved. The man was filthy rich, but he wasn't respected. With Pompey's reputation and with his military clientele, Crassus's wealth and influence among the financiers and indebted senators, and Caesar's oratorical skills and ability to manipulate the urban mob, the triumvirate was able to obtain everything it aimed for. In 60 BCE, the fragility of the Republic was exposed.
Which brings us to the man that you've all been waiting for, Gaius Julius Caesar.
Yes.
Caesar belonged to an ancient and distinguished Roman clan that had fallen behind in the competition for political office and prestige. The Julii, however, made up in pretensions what they lacked in recent achievements. They traced their ancestry back to the goddess Venus and her son, the Trojan refugee Aeneas, as well as to his descendants Romulus and Remus. Politically, Caesar had been aligned with the Marian party in his youth, having been related to both Marius and Cinna through marriage.
Caesar survived the Sullan terror in part because of his youth and in part because of his lack of prominence. And I have to say, though, he showed courage in refusing to repudiate his family relations or their politics. In 63 BC, when he obtained his first political office, and the office was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, he obtained it by bribery and appeals to the populace. By that time, he was best known for his extravagant debts, a reputation for lax personal morals. He was supposed to have had affairs with many of the wives of his fellow senators, and his extraordinary oratorical skills. He was considered, along with Cicero, to be the finest orator of his day, which gained him a popular following. Caesar had the ability to mingle easily with both the best men in Rome and with the masses, as well as an uncanny sense of what needed to be done and the boldness to take risks and act decisively. These qualities not only carried Caesar to political prominence, they also served to make him the greatest Roman general of his day, much to the surprise of his contemporaries. Even after his military successes as praetor in Spain in 61 BC, Caesar was still thought of by the elite as a demagogue with lavish tastes, extravagant debts, whose most famous conquests were the wives of his colleagues. Unlike Pompey, whose entire adulthood was spent leading troops, Caesar was a latecomer to war. He was 39 years old before he achieved his first command. Few of his contemporaries could have imagined that within 3 years, Caesar would begin a military career that would eclipse Pompey's, a military career that would culminate, in fact, with the defeat and death of his former friend and rival. Caesar as consul fulfilled his promises to Pompey. He oversaw the ratification of Pompey's organization of Rome's eastern frontier and brought a bill to the popular assemblies to purchase land for the settlement of Pompey's veterans and for Rome's urban poor. The urban poor were Caesar's core constituency, and by including them in the bill, Caesar was demonstrating his bona fides as a popularis. When Caesar's fellow consul, an old-line conservative, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, attempted to block the plebeian assembly from voting on the bill, an enraged mob grabbed him, they knocked him down along with his entourage, and then they dumped a bucket of manure upon his head, a detail which we have, in fact, from a speech by Cicero, and they broke his fasces. That they just happened to have a bucket filled with manure suggests that this was perhaps not a spontaneous assault. Bibulus appealed to the Senate, but was basically told to suck it up. Humiliated, a petulant Bibulus refused to attend the Senate for the remainder of his term of office, leaving Caesar, essentially, as sole consul.
The joke was that this was really the consulship of Julius and Caesar.
Yeah, and that is the last that we will hear of poor Bibulus. Back to Caesar. Even though Caesar had a very successful consular year, he was looking forward to what would follow it. Roman provinces were governed by proconsuls, that is, by consuls who had completed their term of office. By 58 BC, the proconsulship was almost as important as the consulship. If one was awarded prosperous or frontier provinces by the Senate, a proconsul could look forward to opportunities for wealth and glory. Through the influence of Pompey and Crassus, Caesar was awarded by the Senate 3 provinces for his proconsulship: Cisalpine Gaul, now northern Italy; Illyricum, the northwestern Balkans along the Adriatic coast; and Transalpine Gaul in southeastern France, which is modern-day Provence. This was exactly what Caesar had been hoping for. Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum were prime areas for military recruitment. Transalpine Gaul, which was added almost as an afterthought, provided Caesar with what he really wanted: an opportunity for military conquest and glory. In the early 4th century BCE, Gauls had invaded Rome and sacked the city. This ancient historical memory was refreshed by the Gallic aid given to Hannibal during his invasion of Italy, and by the fierce fighting that had taken place when the Romans had secured the Po River Valley in the early 2nd century. Though not an immediate threat, the Gauls, like the Germans, had a name that aroused fear and antipathy in Rome.
We talked in the previous episode about the uses and abuses of history. Here is a prime example of why historical context matters.
Because most of what we know about Caesar's Gallic campaigns comes from Caesar's own writing. It's tempting to downplay Caesar's achievement. But his military achievement in Gaul really can't be exaggerated. In less than a decade, he doubled the size of the Roman Empire, subduing a population numbering in the millions with an army that never exceeded 50,000 men. He was able to accomplish this because he understood how to exploit to its fullest the abilities of the highly disciplined and well-trained Roman army of the late Republic. No Roman general of the Republic made better use of the army's engineering capabilities and speed of movement. And along with his strategic sense and analytical abilities, Caesar possessed a charisma that inspired his men to obey and follow him, eventually even to Rome itself. That Caesar did not assume his proconsulship with the intention of conquering all of Gaul is almost certain. Indeed, Caesar may be credited with inventing Gaul through his writings and conquests, which provided a unity and cohesion to tribes only loosely connected by language and culture.
The Gauls? Who were the Gauls?
Who were the Gauls?
But Caesar's military activities were anything but accidental. For him, the proconsular command represented an opportunity to obtain the political capital, that is, the cash and glory, necessary to achieve his goal of being recognized as the first citizen in Rome. No threat to the province or to Rome's allies was too petty to serve as an excuse for war, nor were the economic benefits of the campaigns incidental. Even in the midst of military campaigning, politics was never far from Caesar's thoughts. A master of the Latin language, Caesar wrote commentaries on his campaigns in Gaul for public consumption in Rome.
And he wrote them in simple, straightforward Latin that could be easily understood by ordinary people, and which even today makes his commentaries among the very first works read by students learning Latin. But the most important point is that Caesar wrote them to keep his name current in Rome and to squelch any rumors about his illicit character of his activities as a proconsul. And those rumors were rampant in Rome. Caesar presented himself in his writings as driven by duty to Rome. He only waged war to forestall threats to Rome or to protect Rome's Gallic client states against their neighbors. In doing so, he ended up conquering all of Gaul, a region consisting of dozens of large tribal confederations and hundreds of lesser independent political units. Caesar boasted that in conquering Gaul, he killed 1 million people, enslaved another 1 million, subjugated 300 clans, and destroyed 800 cities. These numbers may be exaggerated. Romans were not known for downplaying their achievements, nor were they really known for having much empathy for foreign peoples. Caesar's treatment of the Eburones, a tribe that dwelt in eastern Belgium and the southern Netherlands, can best be described as genocide. The Eburones made the fatal mistake of ambushing a Roman force. Caesar responded by inviting the neighboring tribes to plunder the Eburones, so that he would not be risking any of his troops unnecessarily, and then to ensure the extinction of the tribe, he ordered that all their fields be burnt and their cattle taken, so that they would not be able to survive the winter.
Some historians, notably Sherwin White, accept Caesar's presentation of his motives at face value, arguing that he never planned to conquer all of Gaul. His aggressive defense of his province and allies, rather than any conscious design, led him into one campaign after another until all of the potentially hostile forces in the region had been reduced to submission.
Just shows how good a job Caesar did with his commentaries. I would say that most ancient historians are less persuaded. Caesar wanted to have Transalpine Gaul as part of his proconsulship precisely for this reason. It gave him the opportunity to raise and to use armies. Like Pompey in the east, Caesar did not annex territory to be ruled directly from Rome, but instead established a network of client states. The enemies of these client states then became enemies of Rome, which meant that Caesar could justly wage war against them.
We mentioned the theory of Roman just war in the previous episode. As a reminder, the Romans of the Republican period believed that it was necessary to have a just cause before declaring war. Wars were just if they were fought in self-defense or to correct or avenge an injury or an insult. Underlying this ideology of just war was the idea that the gods are just and good and will only support the just side in wars. The so-called filial law and its religious rituals made this point.
Yeah. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars are as interesting for what they leave out. Any reference, for example, to the enormous personal wealth that Caesar gained through the conquests as they are for what they tell us. The character of Caesar in these is always referred to in the third person.
Who does that remind you of?
He whose name I will not mention. Caesar presents himself as a traditional Roman magistrate and commander intent upon protecting the interests of Rome and of Roman's friends and clients. He was personally brave and a good fighting man, as well as an outstanding strategist and tactician. As a politician, Caesar had learned how to appeal to the common citizenry without ever letting them forget who he was. Caesar of the Julian gens, a patrician who condescended to care for and look out for the interests of ordinary Romans. He applied these lessons to his military command. Caesar took pride in being able to outmarch and outfight much younger men. He went into battle without a helmet, his face exposed, and clad in his red robe of command. He did this so that he would always be visible to his soldiers. It made him an obvious target, but it also inspired his troops to fight harder to impress him. Like Alexander, whom Caesar admired, Caesar took pride in asking nothing of his men that he himself would not undertake. This was one of the reasons that they loved him. Caesar, in his commentaries, both the Gallic War and the commentaries on the Civil War, always shows himself to be concerned with the welfare of his troops. He singles out for praise ordinary soldiers who distinguish themselves. He is especially laudatory about his centurions, the ordinary soldiers who had risen to the position of a Roman NCO are praised for their courage and discipline.
This is obviously, of course, a reflection upon the quality of their commander.
Yes, of course. The Gauls, in contrast, are portrayed as brave fighters, but also as unreliable, superstitious, impetuous, and giving to outbursts of anger and despair, a barbarous and almost childlike people. I'm actually reminded about how American Indians are depicted in Westerns in the 1930s, 40s, and throughout much of the 50s. In reality, many of the Gallic tribes that Caesar subdued had well-developed political and cultural institutions, and most importantly to Caesar, prosperous economies based on markets, coinage, and commodity production. Even in Rome, the Gauls were well known for their craftsmanship and leather goods. Gaul, moreover, was dotted with towns as reflected by the numerous sieges in which Caesar engaged.
Plutarch, who based himself on Caesar's own estimates, reports that Caesar took over 800 towns during his campaigns. The surplus wealth of the Gallic tribes was such that their temples were brimming with gold votive offerings, which were melted down and pocketed by Caesar. The wealth that Caesar acquired as proconsul was such that he was able to double the wages of his legionaries, make his legates, tribunes, and even centurions wealthy men, build magnificent public works in Rome and its provinces, and lavish enormous bribes and gifts upon political friends and allies. Plutarch reports that when Caesar brought home all the gold that he had taken from Gallic temples, the price of the metal among Roman speculators dropped precipitously by a fourth. Glory, greed, political advantage, and even duty to the state spurred Caesar on.
Yeah, I kind of like Caesar was supposed to have boasted that he had killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. Now, that probably is an exaggeration, but the fact that he would make that exaggeration, I mean, there's a sort of genocidal aspect to this.
There really is.
Yeah. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the political climate was disintegrating. In the 50s, bribery and street violence became the staples of political campaigns. Given the turbulence and corruption, the regular mechanisms for even holding an election broke down. The years 55, 53, 52 all began without consuls in office because they couldn't have elections. Caesar himself contributed to the problem by funding thugs like Clodius to look after his political interests in his absence. In fact, in the summer of 54 BCE, 2 of Caesar's candidates for consul were caught red-handed, bribing the 2 seated consuls, presumably with Gallic cash, to help them win the election. Cicero grew so despairing at the state of affairs that he lamented in a letter to his brother, quote, "There really is no republic in existence," end quote.
The triumvirate, which had held together longer than anyone expected, had begun to fray as well, due to the mutual suspicion between the dynasts. Caesar's friendship with Pompey was based on neither affection nor admiration. Recognizing the fragility of their friendship, Caesar had given his daughter in marriage to Pompey in order to create personal and familial bonds. But Julia's death in childbirth in 54 BC was not only a personal tragedy for both men, but it removed the strongest bond uniting the two. What remained was only mutual convenience, and it was becoming clear that Caesar's success in Gaul was not at all convenient for Pompey. The other foundation of the triumvirate was mutual fear and suspicion. An alliance of 3 men meant that no one of them could gain decisive advantage over his 2 partners.
Yes, the stability of 3 legs.
It is a 3-legged stool.
Yeah, but what happens when one of those legs are taken away? And that happened in 53 BCE with the death of Crassus. And that all but guaranteed the final rupture of the alliance between Pompey and Caesar. In 54 BCE, Crassus finally got his heart's desire. As proconsular governor of Syria, he had at last the opportunity for a military command and a chance for real glory. On his own initiative, and without even a pretext of provocation, Crassus invaded Parthia, Persia, with his 7 legions.
Don't invade Persia.
No, it doesn't work. How the Senate would have responded to Crassus's show of contempt for their authority in foreign affairs is unknown, for Crassus didn't live long enough to face their reproaches. His legions were totally destroyed by heavy Parthian cavalry and mounted archers in a running battle fought near Carrhae, modern-day Haran. 20,000 Romans were killed, including Crassus's son, Publius, who had been Caesar's former legate. Another 10,000 Romans were enslaved. Crassus's head was displayed to dramatic effect at the Armenian court during a performance of Euripides. I love that. You see, they're really classy. Performance of Euripides' Bacchae, given in honor of the Parthian king's triumph. And I guess it makes sense because at the climax of that play, women intoxicated by the god Dionysius tear apart the body of Pentheus. Pentheus's queen mother carries her son's head back to the court, believing that it is the head of a lion. Instead of earning a triumph, Crassus ended up as a stage prop. The Romans were shamed, the Parthians were exalted, and they kept the Roman legionary standards as mementos of their victory.
That really hurts.
Yeah.
Then there were 2. As long as Crassus was alive, Pompey needed Caesar's friendship to balance Crassus's wealth, connections, and cunning. Caesar had been very much a junior partner when the alliance had been formed. Pompey may have been threatened by Crassus, but certainly not by Caesar. How could he be? Caesar's accomplishments in 61 BC were nothing compared to Pompey's, and his boasts about the dignitas of the Julian clan rang hollow when compared with Pompey's well-earned auctoritas. But Gaul had changed all that. While Pompey lingered in Rome, Caesar was winning victories and sending back to the city reports of military success, money for the building of public works, and exotic slaves. Pompey grew jealous. With Crassus and Julia's death, neither political need nor personal tie remained to undergird the friendship.
Although the tiny group of Optimates who led the Senate still regarded Pompey with suspicion, they now feared Caesar even more. The endemic political violence in Rome, moreover, had become so pronounced that the Senate could no longer ignore it. The tribune Clodius, a Claudian who had decided to make his mark as a popular leader, and to do so had renounced his patrician family and had gotten himself adopted by a plebeian so that he could stand for the office of tribune. Clodius ruled the streets as the master of a mob of thugs. A sometimes ally of Caesar, Clodius helped make Roman elections eventful. That's probably a good way of putting it.
Right.
In November of 56 BCE, for example, his followers had attempted to beat Cicero to death, and when they had failed in this endeavor, they proceeded to burn down the house of Titus Annius Milo, a rival aristocratic gang leader. Matters became so unsettled that in 1054 BCE, consular elections were delayed for about a half a year. The elections of magistrates were similarly held up in 52 BCE, the year that Milo, who was one of the candidates for consul, killed Clodius, who was standing for praetor. Clodius's angry supporters carried his body into the Curia, the meeting place of the Senate, piled up tables and benches into a funeral pyre, and set fire to it. Whether by intention or not, The entire building caught fire and burned to the ground, a fitting symbol for the conduct of politics in the last years of the Republic.
The Senate declared a state of emergency and turned to Pompey. Though proconsul for the two Spains, Pompey had conveniently contrived to remain in residence in Rome, supervising his province from afar. As the man of the hour, Pompey hoped to be named dictator, but had to settle for the office of consul without colleague. His charge was to restore order, which he did, by force. What Pompey's ultimate goals were is not at all clear then or now. The burning question was whether he would abandon Caesar in favor of the Optimates. No one knew the answer, perhaps not even Pompey himself. On the one hand, Pompey had finally achieved the full recognition of his auctoritas so long denied him by the Optimates. On the other hand, he was clever enough to realize that the threat of Caesar was precisely what made him acceptable to Cato and his crowd. On the urging of the Senate, he demanded a legion from Caesar, ostensibly to prepare for a campaign in Syria, and asked for the return of a second, which he had loaned to Caesar during the Great Gallic Rebellion. Caesar acceded graciously to the requests, showering his soon-to-be former legionaries with gifts to show his gratitude for their service, and promptly began to recruit a legion from the native Gauls, a serious breach of custom that dictated that only Roman citizens could be legionaries.
That's worth emphasizing. Roman armies in the Republic were always citizen armies. Every Roman army would have auxiliary troops to supplement and complement the Roman legions, and these were drawn from client states. But a critical distinction was drawn between citizen legionaries and non-citizen auxiliaries, and Caesar, needing troops who would be loyal to him, was blurring that distinction.
The two legions Caesar turned over were retained under Pompey's command in Italy.
Yeah, so much for taking them to Syria to avenge the death of Crassus. Something was more pressing than avenging the death of Crassus. But back to the story. Caesar himself faced a dilemma. His only safety from legal prosecution, and he knew he was going to be prosecuted, was to win the consulship for 49 BC. Provincial governance during the Republic was rife with corruption. Bribery was a way of life. Lacking any oversight from Rome, it was the only way that a provincial could get justice or protection, especially from the extortion of tax collectors who had paid a flat sum of money for the privilege of collecting taxes and pocketing them. Provincial governors were the worst offenders. It was said that a proconsul had to make 3 fortunes out of his province: one to pay debts contracted in getting himself elected consul, one to bribe the jury when he was brought to trial after his proconsulship had ended, and one to keep for himself. That Caesar faced charges of malfeasance was not exceptional or unexpected. What was the political forces arrayed against him that made acquittal unlikely.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
As long as Caesar was either consul or proconsul, he was immune from prosecution. He was certain to win it. He had the popular support to win. He knew that. But here's the problem. Law forbade any commander, any military commander, from standing for office while still in command of his troops. To register his candidacy, Caesar would have to resign his command and return to Rome. And he knew that if he did that, he would be legally vulnerable to prosecution. A proposal by his friends in Rome, led by one of the tribunes to exempt him from this law, was defeated by his enemies. On January 7th, the Senate removed Caesar's province from him and gave it to one of his political enemies, which means also removing his armies. When the tribunes tried to veto the decree, they were attacked and they fled to the safety of Caesar's camp. Caesar, until the very last minute, attempted to negotiate with his political opponents and to avoid a final break with Pompey. But all of his proposals were rejected. What was at stake, as far as Caesar was concerned, was more than just simply his life. It was his dignitas. Even if the law forbade one to stand for office while still in command, Caesar's service to the Republic had earned him preferential treatment. The refusal of his enemies to give it was a sign of their implacable hostility. Caesar had to choose between marching on Rome like Sulla had, or meekly turning himself in for prosecution and face certain exile and maybe even death.
Pompey also had a choice: to stand with the Optimates and the Constitution, or with Caesar. The constitutional issue was a convenient excuse, but not a real consideration. Pompey's whole career had been one long exception to the Sullan constitution. The Optimates played upon his vanity, and Caesar's victories piqued the great man's envy. Even if Caesar acknowledged Pompey's primacy, the populace would not. In the final analysis, Pompey's sense of dignitas, even more than duty, led him to oppose his fellow triumvir. As Lucan observed, Caesar could admit no superior, and Pompey no equal.
Do you hear the hounds howling in the background? They're howling for Caesar's blood right now.
Indeed.
Actually, that's my little dog Buddy, who's about as cute as can be, and probably is barking at a squirrel. Okay. Caesar, with only the 13th Legion and some Gallic and German auxiliaries at his disposal, acted decisively. Claiming to be defending the sanctity of the tribunate and the Roman constitution, why does that sound so familiar? He crossed the Rubicon River, the small creek in northeastern Italy that marked the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy. Because Caesar was educated in the classics, he marked the occasion by quoting the comic poet Menander, "The die is cast." To clarify, that's die not as fabric color, but die as the plural of dice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Caesar was gambling, and he knew it. For a Roman commander to bring his legions into Italy without the permission of the Senate was an act of treason. Caesar risked the charge and marched on Rome as Sulla had done a generation before. He gained support as he marched. Though his Optimates opponents liked to present him as a second Catalina, Catalan conspiracy, appealing only to desperate debtors and degenerates, Caesar enjoyed support from men of substance as well as from the poor. His most trusted legate, Labienus, who he celebrates in the commentaries on the Gallic Wars, deserted him for Pompey, and he did so because he had been a longtime client as well as a neighbor of Pompey. Labienus came from an equestrian family from Picenum, the region that was dominated by Pompey's family. That he became a military legate under Caesar was part of Caesar's friendship with Pompey, and Caesar's praise of Labienus in his commentaries was again a gesture of friendship to his fellow triumvir. Readers of Caesar's commentaries might be surprised that Labienus deserted Caesar and supported Pompey and fought for Pompey, but I think that Romans of the time would have expected that. It shows you the personal ties are the most important thing here. Pompey, who had contemptuously responded to concerns about Caesar's forces with the comment, quote, "All I have to do is stamp my foot and armies of foot and horses will appear," end quote, decided it would be more strategic and advantageous to retreat to Greece than to gamble everything upon a battle in Italy, no matter how many times he stamped his foot. Caesar's attempt to intercept Pompey failed, and Pompey embarked with 2 former Caesarian legions. Caesar was now master of Italy, but he still faced the forces of a general who had never been defeated in battle. The Roman elite may well have expected Caesar to follow the lead of Sulla and initiate a new round of political purges, but Caesar took a very different approach. He ostentatiously demonstrated clemency to his defeated enemies. When the garrison of the Italian city of Corfinium, under the command of one of Caesar's most vocal political critics, surrendered, Caesar required only that enemy, Domitius, his soldiers and the 50 Roman senators and their sons who had taken refuge in the city, all he demanded of them was to take an oath of allegiance to him, and then allowed them to leave the city with all of their possessions. Caesar explained his clemency in a letter to two of his supporters, who probably were just, what's going through his mind? What Caesar explained is, quote, I had determined of my own accord to appear as moderate as possible and to try to become reconciled with Pompey. Let us see if in this way we can gain the goodwill of all and enjoy a lasting victory, since other commanders have not been able by cruelty either to escape hatred or maintain their victory for a long time, except for Lucius Sulla, and I have no intention of imitating him. End quote. No, even Cicero was impressed and observed to a friend that if Caesar continued to act this way, quote, he will be loved most by those who feared him most, end quote. This would be the policy that Caesar followed throughout the Civil War, showing mercy to his defeated enemies. One, however, needs to understand Caesar's clemency within the context of Roman culture and their value system. Caesar was not turning the other cheek. His clemency was an expression of power and dominance. It announced to all that Caesar was so powerful that he could afford to be merciful. An acceptance of Caesar's clemency was also a public statement. It was an acknowledgement of Caesar's superiority and transformed the former enemy into a client. Cato the Younger, who spent his life maintaining and defending conservative Roman principles and morality, understood this well. After Pompey's defeat in the Battle of Pharsalus and his subsequent death in Egypt, many of Pompey's supporters, including Cicero, hurried back to Rome to seek Caesar's pardon. In contrast, Cato, rather than bending the knee to Caesar, took his own life. Upon hearing of Cato's suicide, Caesar lamented that it had deprived him of the opportunity of pardoning him, which is exactly why Cato had done it. Caesar's confidence ultimately proved misplaced. Several of the senators who participated in his assassination, including Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, were recipients of Caesar's clemency. Fear of Caesar's ambition and devotion to the ideal of the Republic, in their cases, trumped the ethical debt that they had incurred by accepting his clemency.
In the civil war that followed, Caesar showed himself to be a superior strategist and tactician to Pompey. Pompey's death in Egypt while in flight left Caesar in sole control of Rome.
But it's interesting to note how Caesar responded to news of Pompey's death at the hands of a Roman mercenary serving Ptolemy XIII. He expressed outrage and grief. Pompey had been his political rival, but he was also a hero of the Republic and deserved better than this treachery. Caesar demanded that both the 14-year-old Ptolemy and his older sister Cleopatra, who were engaged in a civil war for the throne, disband their military forces and make peace with one another. To ensure this, Caesar himself went to Alexandria. Caesar attempted to negotiate a settlement between the siblings, but found himself in the midst of a civil war in which his own forces were outnumbered by Ptolemy's. He finally prevailed. Ptolemy drowned while attempting to flee, and Cleopatra became sole ruler of Egypt. She also became famously Caesar's mistress. They had a son, whom Cleopatra named Caesarion. While Cleopatra proudly and publicly named Caesar as the father, Caesar himself remained silent on the matter, possibly because his wife Calpurnia, who belonged to a prominent Roman family, had only borne him a daughter. Caesar's return to Rome was triumphant in all senses of that word.
His series of 4 triumphs, which celebrated his victories in Gaul, Pontus, and Africa over the foreign enemies of Rome — triumphs were not granted for killing fellow Romans — were dazzling pageants. Riding in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses, an honor previously accorded only to the legendary hero Camillus, Caesar led the parade through the streets of Rome, followed by soldiers and slaves bearing trophies and models symbolizing his conquests, and wagon loads of booty worth 1.5 million sesterces, as well as gold crowns weighing 20,414 pounds.
I love it that they actually have the exact weight.
I know.
Romans were really good at keeping administrative records. Caesar's 17-year-old grandnephew, Octavian, and we're going to hear a lot more about him in the next episode, was accorded the honor usually reserved for sons of walking behind the triumphator's chariot, and he was soon to become Caesar's son.
He followed this with spectacles designed to impress the populace, a naval battle on the Tiber that involved 4,000 rowers and 1,000 soldiers, games and displays of exotic beasts, a public feast in which thousands of citizens dined upon lampreys and fine wine. At festivities' end, Caesar dedicated a magnificent marble temple to his divine ancestor, Venus Genetrix, goddess of peace and prosperity, set within an entirely new forum. This is a very, very ostentatious display.
Yeah, really. He also paid from his own pocket a program for debt relief.
The Senate honored the victor of the civil wars with the office of dictator for 10 years, to complement his election earlier that year to his third consulship. To reflect his unprecedented authority and dignitas, Caesar was accorded an escort of 72 lictors.
Wow.
That is 3 times as many, right, as we've previously seen. Honored with a statue of him standing on a globe in the Capitoline Temple to Jupiter, and granted the privilege of sitting among the consuls in the Senate, even when he did not hold that office, along with the right to speak first in all senatorial debates.
Which I would point out means that he is the first name on the Roman census, and that's a formal recognition of being the first citizen of Rome.
Right. The Senate also granted to Caesar the rights and privileges of a tribune of the plebeians, which gave him the power to veto legislation and senatorial edicts, and it made his person sacrosanct.
Yeah, and that wasn't going to help him any more than it helped the Gracchi brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. In his capacity as dictator, Caesar pursued an ambitious agenda of reform.
Caesar's most lasting reform was to replace the traditional Roman lunar calendar with a solar calendar that established the year as consisting of 365 days. To enhance his political control, Caesar persuaded the Senate to confer on him the powers to appoint magistrates, including consuls. He raised the number of quaestors to 40 and of praetors to 16. He appointed 400 new senators. Many of the new senators were non-Roman Italians, bringing to fruition the process of Italian enfranchisement, which had begun with the social wars. All were men of substance and partisans of Caesar. His vision of a unified Roman Empire extended beyond this, as he proposed the extension of Latin rights to the provinces and awarded citizenship to supporters among the provincial elites. Caesar also fulfilled his promises to his veteran troops. His centurions became wealthy men, while even the ordinary soldiers retired as men of substance, enriched by generous gifts of land and cash.
Although Caesar's programs increased his favor among the Roman people, he had become increasingly autocratic in his manner and actions. He allowed, or perhaps even encouraged, provincials in the Hellenistic East to place diadems on the heads of his statues.
Remember we said about the Romans having this almost pathological hatred of the idea of kingship?
They really don't like it. And this would have been an honor reserved for gods.
Yeah.
In January of 44 BC, a grateful Senate appointed Caesar Dictator Perpetuus.
That's not even a real Roman office.
Right, that's not a thing. And this translated into dictator for life, an unheard of honor, and ordained that an oath of allegiance be taken in his name. On February 15th, Caesar's lieutenant, Mark Antony, publicly attempted to crown Caesar with a royal diadem. Caesar was too politically astute, and perhaps too much of a Republican, to take the title of king. He took the diadem off, saying that only Jupiter could be the king of the Romans. But he didn't need the title of king to rule Rome as an autocrat. His political enemies and even some of his old friends began to mutter about his arrogance and ambition, and this evolved into a conspiracy to assassinate him.
They found a loophole in the designation of Caesar as dictator for life.
On the Ides of March, March 15th, a month after Mark Antony's attempt to crown him, Caesar was surrounded by the conspirators and stabbed to death in the Senate. The conspirators announced that they had done this to restore the Republic.
And it was. Very, very briefly.
Well, Richard, I think we've done it again. There's just so much interesting material to talk about, but we're at a logical stopping point, and I think it's best that we break things off here and come back for a third time to finish the story of the fall of the Roman Republic.
Thank you, Jenny. It's always a delight having you as my co-host.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's always a pleasure.
Until next time, bye for now.